I never thought betrayal could arrive dressed in silk and pearls, smiling sweetly across the breakfast table. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I am 62 years old, and I believed I had already survived the hardest storms of life. When my husband Richard passed away last winter, I thought grief would be my only battle. But I was wrong, because the true storm came not from his death, but from the people still living under my roof. It happened on a Tuesday morning. The kind of morning that feels too ordinary to hold disaster. I had just returned from the market, carrying a bag of apples Richard always loved. As I parked the car, a stranger appeared at my gate, a young woman with trembling hands clutching a folder. "Ma'am," she whispered, "please don't sign anything today." Her eyes darted nervously toward the house, and my stomach twisted. With a sneeze, before I could ask her name, she pressed the folder into my hands and fled down the street. I stood frozen in my driveway, staring at the papers inside, my pulse hammering in my ears. They were copies of legal documents stamped and signed, claiming that I had agreed to transfer Richard's company shares to my son's wife, Claire. My knees nearly buckled. Claire, my daughter-in-law, the woman I had trusted like a daughter, the woman who promised to look after me in my old age. As I read, the words blurred through my tears. Apparently, these documents claimed I was unfit to manage finances, suffering from memory decline. They bore a forged signature that looked hauntingly like my own. My breath caught in my throat. If these papers were real, then Claire was attempting to erase me, to strip me of everything Richard and I built together. I staggered into the house, my hands trembling, my mind reeling. I didn't yet know if the stranger's warning was truth or trick, but one thing was certain. My life was no longer safe inside my own family. I carried the folder into my study and closed the door behind me. My hands were trembling so badly that I had to set the papers down on Richard's oak desk before I dropped them. The smell of his cologne still lingered faintly in the wood, and the ache of his absence stabbed me all over again. I whispered his name into the silence, as though he might answer, as though he might tell me what to do. Richard. And I had been married for 40 years, through lean days and golden days, through the raising of our son Daniel and the heartbreak of losing our first child. He built his company from the ground up, Hayes Engineering, a modest firm that grew into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. He always said the business was not just numbers on paper, but the legacy he wanted to leave for me and for our family. I believed him, I trusted him, I stood by him through every late night and every risk he ever took. After his death, Daniel moved back into the house temporarily with his wife Claire, or so they told me. They claimed they wanted to support me, to keep me from being lonely. But in truth, I sometimes felt like a guest in my own home. Claire was always busy redecorating rooms without asking, moving Richard's belongings into storage, insisting that the house needed a modern touch. I bit my tongue more times than I can count, because I thought maybe change would help Daniel cope. Maybe Claire was simply trying to help. But little things began to gnaw at me. Claire would interrupt me mid-sentence during family dinners, correcting details of my own stories as if I could not remember them. She would sigh softly when I misplaced my glasses, exchanging knowing glances with Daniel, planting seeds of doubt where none had existed. At first, I dismissed it as my own grief, making me oversensitive, but gradually the pattern sharpened until I could no longer ignore it. There was the evening I tried to cook Richard's favorite roast, and Claire loudly announced that perhaps I should not handle sharp knives anymore. Daniel laughed awkwardly, telling her not to fuss, but the sting of humiliation burned deep in my chest. Another time, I walked into the living room to find Claire sorting through Richard's files, claiming she was organizing them for the lawyer. When I asked her to stop, she gave me that pitying smile and said, "Of course, Eleanor, you probably just need rest." I began to notice how often she used that word probably, as though my certainty was always questionable, as though my memory was always failing. It was subtle, a slow drip of poison, but poison all the same. And Daniel, my only son, seemed blind to it. Perhaps he was too weary from grief. Perhaps he simply trusted his wife more than his mother. But either way, the distance between us grew. I thought back to the early days when Claire first entered our lives. She was young, beautiful, ambitious, and I admit, I adored her. I welcomed her with open arms, thrilled that Daniel had found someone who seemed to truly care for him. I shared recipes, family heirlooms, even Richard's advice about investing, thinking I was handing pieces of our legacy to the next generation. Never once did I imagine that those gifts could be twisted into weapons. After Richard's funeral, I overheard Claire on the phone one night, her voice low and urgent. She said something about assets, about needing signatures, and when I stepped into the hall, she quickly ended the call. I wanted to confront her, but Daniel walked in just then, and she wrapped her arms around him, whispering that she was only making arrangements for his future. He kissed her forehead tenderly, and in that moment, I told myself I must be imagining things, that grief was clouding my reason. But the stranger's warning at the gate shattered that fragile illusion. Suddenly, every sigh, every correction, every so-called act of kindness fell into place like jagged puzzle pieces. Claire was not protecting me. She was preparing to erase me. I remembered how she insisted on handling all communication with the lawyer after Richard's death. She claimed it was to spare me from stress, but perhaps it was to hide the truth from me. I remembered how Daniel mentioned casually that Claire was helping with the company's transition, even though Richard had always promised I would oversee things until Daniel was ready. I remembered, too, how she volunteered to drive me to every appointment, always keeping herself between me and any outside information. As these memories surged, I felt both fury and shame. How could I have been so blind? How could I have let her play me so easily under my own roof? I pressed my hands against Richard's desk, steadying myself with the thought of his voice, his strength. He used to say, "Eleanor, storms will come, but you are stronger than you know." I closed my eyes and let the words settle in my bones. For months, I had been shrinking, allowing grief to make me small, allowing Claire to make me doubt myself. But the folder in front of me was a weapon, and Richard's memory was my armor. I knew then that this was not just neglect, not just betrayal. This was war, and I was no longer willing to surrender. I sat alone in the study, the folder open in front of me, and I realized this was the moment that would define the rest of my life. I could either crumble under Claire's schemes, letting her steal Richard's legacy from my hands, or I could fight back with every ounce of strength I had left. My heart pounded against my ribs, the weight of both fear and determination pressing down on me. I thought of Richard again, his steady eyes, the way he used to tell me that surrender was never in our family's blood. He had fought for every contract, every partnership, every inch of respect his company earned, and he would expect me to do no less. For a brief moment, I doubted myself, wondering if I truly had the power to stand against lawyers, against my own son, against Claire's manipulation. But then I looked at the forged signature again, and something inside me snapped into clarity. I whispered out loud enough, and I felt the words steady me like a blade in my hand. I would not allow her to write me out of my own life. I would not allow Daniel to be blinded by her lies. I had lost my husband, but I would not lose myself. I gathered the folder carefully, tucking the forged documents back inside, and I made a silent vow to Richard. I will protect what you built. I will guard what you left for me, and I will not let betrayal win. In that instant, grief transformed into fire, and fear became resolve. I began to think strategically, the way Richard once did during business negotiations. If Claire believed I was weak, then I would let her keep believing it, just long enough to expose her. If she thought I was too fragile to notice her tricks, then I would play the part, and when the moment came, I would strike with proof and precision. I knew I needed allies, people who would believe me when Daniel surely would not. The stranger at the gate came to mind, the trembling young woman who handed me these documents and vanished. Who was she, and why was she willing to risk warning me? I needed to find her, to thank her, and perhaps to gather more information from her. I also thought of Richard's old friend, Thomas Caldwell, the family attorney who had retired just before Richard's passing. He had always been loyal, always straightforward, and he knew the company's foundation inside out. Perhaps he could guide me through this storm, or at least confirm what was legally possible. My hands no longer shook as I picked up the phone, though I did not dial yet. I knew I could not act rashly, not without timing on my side. I needed to watch Claire, to see how far she was willing to go, to gather evidence of her deceit before making my move. I rose from the chair, smoothing my skirt, and caught sight of myself in the mirror across the room. My face was pale, drawn with grief, but in my eyes I saw a spark that had not been there in months. It was the spark of a woman who refused to be erased. That night, at dinner, I studied Claire more closely than ever before. She served the food with her usual grace, smiling at Daniel, pouring me a glass of wine as though nothing were amiss. But now I noticed the quick glance she gave the clock, The way her hand lingered on her phone, the tightness in her smile whenever I mentioned Richard's name. I played along, pretending to laugh at her small jokes, pretending to be tired when she offered to clear the table. But inside, I was cataloging every detail, every word, every gesture, every slip could become part of the weapon I would use against her. Later that evening, when she finally retreated upstairs, I sat in the quiet of the living room and whispered again, "Enough." This was no longer about grief, no longer about survival. This was about justice, about reclaiming my dignity, about making sure Richard's legacy remained in the hands of someone who loved him, not someone who saw him as a means to an end. I knew then, without a shadow of doubt, that I was done playing the victim. I was ready to become the storm Claire never expected. I knew that waiting forever would not serve me, so within the week I began to set my plan in motion. The first step was locating the mysterious woman who had slipped me the documents, because without her I had nothing but suspicion and a forged signature. I returned to the same market on the same day, wandering past the fruit stalls and flower stands, scanning every face. My heart leapt when I finally saw her, the same slender figure with hurried steps, clutching a worn leather satchel. I approached gently, not wanting to scare her off again, and I said softly, "I think you have something more to tell me." She froze, her eyes widening with fear, and for a moment I thought she would run again, but then she sighed and nodded. Her name was Lily, she explained, and she had once worked as Claire's personal assistant. She told me she had quit weeks earlier when she realized Claire was plotting to push me out of my rightful place. She said she couldn't live with the guilt, and handing me those documents was her attempt to make amends. I listened carefully, my fingers tightening around the strap of my purse, as Lily explained that Claire had a lawyer helping her craft the paperwork. According to Lily, Claire bragged that within months I would be declared unfit, my shares transferred, and the company entirely under her control. My stomach turned at the thought, but instead of despair, I felt a strange calm fill me. Now I had a witness, someone who could confirm the scheme, someone who could help me turn the tide. I asked Lily if she would be willing to testify or at least provide me with more documents, and though she hesitated, she finally agreed. She reached into her satchel and handed me a flash drive, saying it contained recordings of Claire's phone calls and scanned copies of her secret emails. My breath caught as I clutched the small device, realizing it could become my most powerful weapon. That evening, after securing the drive in my desk drawer, I made my second move. I called Thomas Caldwell, Richard's old attorney, and begged him to meet me in private. When we sat together in his study, I poured out everything, showing him the folder, the flash drive, and Lily's testimony. He listened with furrowed brows, then leaned back with a grave expression. He told me that Claire's plan was dangerous but not impossible to fight. He said if we played it carefully, we could not only stop her, but expose her to the entire family and board of directors. My pulse raced as he explained the strategy. We would allow Claire to believe her scheme was succeeding, gathering evidence at each step until the moment of the next shareholders' meeting. Then, when she attempted to present herself as the rightful controller of Richard's shares, we would reveal the truth publicly, leaving her no room to escape. I left Thomas's house that night with renewed strength, the fire in my chest blazing brighter than ever. I no longer felt like a grieving widow, but like a warrior preparing for battle. At home, I continued to play the part of the fragile mother-in-law. I let Claire pour my tea, let her smirk at her own false kindness, let her whisper in Daniel's ear when she thought I wasn't listening. But inside, I was counting down the days, rehearsing the moment when I would rise and shatter her lies. The night before the meeting, I sat in Richard's old armchair, clutching his photograph. I whispered, "Tomorrow, my love, tomorrow I fight for you, for us, for everything we built." A calmness settled over me, sharper than grief, clearer than rage. The stage was set, the evidence was gathered, the players were ready, and I, Eleanor Hayes, was prepared to strike the first blow in this war for truth. I woke up on the morning of the shareholders' meeting with a strange stillness in my chest, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. I dressed in Richard's favorite navy suit, the one he always said made me look like I could command a room, and I pinned his old silver brooch to my collar as a silent reminder that he was still with me. My hands trembled slightly, but it was not from fear. It was from the knowledge that today the masks would fall, and the truth would finally step into the light. I arrived at the company headquarters just after 9, the Grand Glass building reflecting the pale morning sun, As I stepped through the revolving doors, I felt the familiar sting of memories, remembering how often Richard and I had walked these halls together, building our dream from nothing. But today was not about nostalgia. Today was about reclaiming what was mine. Claire was already there, standing tall in her crimson dress, smiling like a queen who believed the crown was already on her head. Daniel stood at her side, his hand resting possessively on her back, his eyes darting to me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. He said, "Mother, I hope you are feeling strong today." But his tone carried the weight of doubt, as though he had already chosen Claire's version of the story over mine. I simply smiled, nodding, and whispered, "Stronger than you think." Before moving past him into the boardroom, the table gleamed under the bright lights, and one by one, the directors filed in, whispering quietly, their eyes shifting between me and Claire. The tension was thick, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every breath feel heavier. Claire began the meeting with her practiced charm, thanking everyone for their support and speaking of Richard's legacy as though she had been the one by his side for decades. Her words dripped with honey, but underneath, I heard the poison, the arrogance of someone who believed the game was already won. She pulled out the folder of documents, the same forged lies I had seen before, and laid them proudly on the table. She declared that I had willingly transferred my shares, and that she and Daniel would be taking full control of the company. For a moment, silence blanketed the room, and I saw several heads nod in reluctant agreement. My chest tightened, but I held my composure, waiting for the exact second Thomas and I had planned. Then I rose slowly, my chair scraping against the floor, the sound sharp as a blade through the quiet. I said calmly, "Before you continue, I have something to share." Claire's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing, but she leaned back clearly amused, clearly certain nothing I said could change her victory. I placed a folder on the table, but it was not forged. It was filled with Lily's testimony. The recordings, the emails, the undeniable proof of Claire's deception. My voice did not tremble as I said, "These are the documents you never expected me to see, Claire, the ones that reveal how you tried to erase me, how you lied to my son, how you plotted to steal what was never yours." The directors leaned forward, whispering furiously, their eyes flicking between me and Claire, confusion spreading across their faces. Claire laughed too loudly, the brittle sound of a woman on the edge. She said, "You cannot prove those are real. Anyone could have fabricated this." But Thomas stepped forward, his voice steady as steel, declaring that he had verified every file, every recording, and that the truth was undeniable. Daniel's face paled as he turned to his wife, whispering harshly, "Claire, what is this?" But she ignored him, her mask finally slipping. She snapped, "Do not act innocent, Daniel. You knew I would get everything, and you wanted it just as much as I did." The room gasped, the betrayal spilling into the open like a wound ripped wide. My son's jaw clenched, but his eyes avoided mine, and in that silence, I realized he had indeed been part of the scheme, even if only by turning a blind eye. The pain pierced deeper than any blade, but I stood taller, knowing this was my chance to reveal the hidden card Richard had left me. I reached into my bag and drew out a sealed envelope, one I had kept hidden for months since the lawyer had delivered it after Richard's funeral. I had not planned to reveal it yet, but in that moment, I knew the time had come. I said, Richard was not blind to the people around him. He knew loyalty and he knew betrayal, and he prepared for both. I opened the envelope, sliding out Richard's handwritten letter and the official codicil to his will. My voice wavered only once as I read, "To my beloved Eleanor, I leave not only my shares, but full controlling interest in the company, safeguarded under her name alone, for I trust her judgment above all others." My throat tightened as I added, "He trusted me, Claire, not you, not even Daniel me." The directors erupted in shock, the codicil passing from hand to hand, the weight of Richard's words silencing every doubt. Claire's face drained of color, and she stumbled back, whispering, "No, this cannot be." Before her fury exploded, she shouted, "You tricked him. You must have forced him." But even she knew the lie carried no power. I stood calmly, clutching the letter, and said, "You see, Claire, the company was never yours to take, and Richard made certain you could never succeed." My words carried across the boardroom, steady, final, undeniable. Daniel buried his face in his hands, shame washing over him, while Claire's rage twisted her features into something unrecognizable. But I no longer cared for their excuses or their downfall, because in that moment, I had already won. The hidden truth had been revealed. The secret Richard left me had crushed their deceit, and the company, our life's work, remained safe in my hands. I looked around the room, my eyes clear, my heart burning with justice, and I knew that this was the moment Richard would have been proudest of me. I thought the boardroom showdown would end the nightmare, but in truth, it was only the beginning. Claire's fury did not cool when the directors sided with me, and Daniel's silence became a heavy chain dragging me deeper into despair. We left the building in strained silence, but once the car doors closed and the driver began the ride home, the mask of civility shattered completely. Claire turned on me, her voice sharp and venomous, hissing that I had humiliated her in front of everyone. Her hands trembled as she pointed a manicured finger at me, accusing me of manipulation, of forging the codicil myself. I said quietly, "The letter was written by Richard in his own hand, witnessed and sealed, and you know that as well as I do." My calm only enraged her further, and Daniel sat frozen beside her, his jaw clenched, refusing to meet my eyes. I looked at my son, my only child, and whispered, "Daniel, did you know about this? Were you part of her plan?" He shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his hair, before muttering, "I didn't think it would go this far, Mother." My chest ached at his words, the betrayal cutting deeper because it came not from a stranger, but from the boy I had once cradled in my arms. I said, "You didn't think, or you didn't care. Which one is it?" Claire smirked at his hesitation, seizing the opportunity to twist the knife. She leaned toward him and said, "Don't let her guilt you, Daniel. Everything we did was for us, for our future, for our children." I snapped, "For your greed. You mean, because you were never satisfied with what you had?" My voice cracked, years of suppressed disappointment breaking free, and Daniel finally shouted back, "Enough, both of you." The car descended into silence after his outburst, but my tears blurred the city lights outside the window. I could not understand how the child Richard and I raised with love, with sacrifice, had grown into this man who could betray me so easily. Claire placed her hand on his arm, whispering soothing words, but I saw the glint of triumph in her eyes, as though even in defeat she still believed she owned him. When we reached the estate, I stepped out first, determined not to show my weakness. I walked into the grand hall, the chandeliers glittering above us, the silence heavy as marble. I turned to face them both, planting myself in the very heart of the home Richard and I built, and I said, "This ends tonight." Claire crossed her arms, tilting her head with mockery, asking, "And what exactly will you do, Eleanor? Exile us from the family, disown your own son?" I said firmly, "I will not exile you, Claire, because you were never truly part of this family to begin with." I turned my gaze to Daniel, and my voice trembled as I continued, "But you, my son, you must decide tonight where you stand." Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came, and in his silence, Claire filled the void. She spat bitter truths, or perhaps bitter lies, telling me Richard had never trusted me with the business, that I had lived in his shadow, that my only worth had been as his wife. My hands shook, but I lifted the letter from Richard once more, holding it high as I declared, "He trusted me more than anyone, and that is why he left it all to me, not you." The air vibrated with tension. Claire's face twisted in rage. Daniel's shoulders slumped under the weight of truth, and I felt my heart pounding like a war drum. I said, "You plotted against me in my own house. You forged my name. You tried to erase me, and still you stand here unashamed." Claire laughed bitterly, saying, "Unashamed, no, Eleanor. Only disappointed, because you were supposed to be weak, and yet somehow you fought back." Her admission was a victory in itself, but it was Daniel's next words that nearly shattered me. He said quietly, "Maybe she was right. Maybe you should have just handed it over, Mother, because what good will you do with it now?" My vision blurred with tears, not from weakness, but from the raw grief of realizing my own son had chosen ambition over blood. I stepped closer, lifting his chin so he had no choice but to meet my eyes, and I whispered, "I may have lost you, Daniel, but I will not lose myself." He flinched at my words, his eyes darting away, and in that moment I knew he was gone, not physically, but emotionally, spiritually, lost to Claire's poison. I straightened my shoulders, wiped my tears, and said, "You may stay in this house tonight, but tomorrow you will both leave." Claire scoffed, saying, "You cannot force us out, not without a fight." But I smiled sadly and replied, "The fight is already over, and you lost." My words echoed through the hall, heavy and final, and even she could not disguise the flicker of fear in her eyes as they retreated upstairs, muttering angrily. I remained in the hall, staring at Richard's portrait on the wall. I whispered, "They may have taken our son's loyalty, my love, but they will never take the heart of what we built." My chest rose and fell with steady breaths, and though my heart ached, I felt a strange peace settle over me. I knew the battle was won, but the war of family was far from over. Yet in that moment, standing alone in the house that carried our memories, I vowed to face whatever came next with dignity, with courage, and with unshakable resolve. I woke the next morning to a house that felt both heavier and lighter at the same time, heavier because of the confrontation that had taken place under its roof, lighter because I had finally spoken the truth that had lived inside me. For years, the silence of dawn wrapped around me, broken only by the soft chirping of birds outside the tall windows. I made myself a cup of tea, my hands steady now, no longer trembling with fear or grief. I stood at the kitchen counter, the very space where Richard and I had shared countless breakfasts, and whispered, "I did it, my love." I stood firm. I imagined his smile, warm and steady, the smile that had always given me courage. And for the first time in months, I felt him with me. I carried my tea into the garden, the roses heavy with dew, and breathed deeply, letting the scent of earth and blossoms remind me that life was still beautiful. The estate, vast and intimidating just yesterday, now felt like a sanctuary again. By mid-morning, the sound of suitcases echoed through the hall. I watched from the garden as Daniel and Claire descended the staircase, their faces tight with anger and resentment. They carried their luggage as though the weight of their choices had finally settled on their shoulders. I did not speak, and neither did they, for what words could bridge the chasm that had opened between us? Claire shot me one last look, sharp as a dagger, but I did not flinch. Daniel glanced at me briefly, his eyes full of something between regret and defiance, but he turned away before I could read it fully. I felt no victory in their departure, only a profound sadness, tempered by the clarity that this was the only way forward. As the car pulled out of the drive, a strange calm filled me, like a storm finally passing over the sea. I walked back inside and gathered the documents Eddie had helped preserve. They would go to the authorities, and justice would take its course. But more importantly, they were proof that Richard had trusted me all along. The letter, his words of love and faith, I placed in a frame on my bedside table, so I would never again doubt the strength he had seen in me. That frame became my anchor, a reminder that even in betrayal, love left me a gift to carry on. In the days that followed, the estate came alive again. I reopened the library shutters, letting sunlight pour into rooms that had sat in shadow. I walked the halls without fear, no longer feeling like a stranger in my own home. I began restoring the gardens, hiring back staff who had once left under Claire's cold rule, and laughter returned to the grounds like spring after winter. At night, I sat by the fire, not with loneliness, but with peace. I realized I had spent too many years living for others, for Richard, for Daniel, for appearances. Now, at last, I would live for myself, with dignity, with independence, with a heart that had endured storms yet refused to break. My grief for Richard softened into gratitude. My sorrow for Daniel transformed into acceptance. I wrote in my journal, the ink flowing like a promise to myself. I wrote, "Eleanor Whitmore is not just a widow, not just a mother, not just a victim of betrayal." I wrote, "She is a woman who stood against deception, who protected her legacy, and who found her voice when others tried to silence her." My pen scratched the page with conviction, each word a declaration of freedom. As the fire crackled, I looked at Richard's portrait above the mantel, his eyes filled with the same quiet strength I carried now. I whispered, "They tried to erase me, but instead, they revealed me, and I will not be hidden ever again." The flames flickered like applause. The house seemed to breathe with me, and I knew I was exactly where I belonged. The battle was over, the wounds still tender, but the future wide open and entirely mine.